Subject Roger emerged from the cocoon perfectly reanimated, appearing younger and healthier than anyone present remembered him. He sobbed uncontrollably for 30 minutes, unresponsive to stimulus, then relaxed into utter serenity and spoke two unintelligible but joyous words. He returned to us of his own accord 2 months later. What he then requested is documented below. Roger's questioning, upon reanimation, was conducted with the appropriate rigor. He responded with candor, enthusiasm, and an unmistakable relief. He was retained under quarantine in a containment unit for a period of 30 days, during which he offered no objection and cooperated completely. His conduct throughout was consistent with what any of the interrogating personnel might have exhibited under comparable circumstances. Following light internal debate, he was unanimously restored to office. The reasoning was, in retrospect, sentimental. Those who had remade him found it difficult to imagine denying themselves the same restoration, should the situation ever be reversed. He rewarded that hubris by resuming his duties with an inspired vigor, consistently displaying deeper insight and wisdom than had been observed prior to the incident. Several changes in his personal habits were, at the time, welcomed. As soon as the remainder of the council permitted it, he began regular fortification treatments for the first time in his career. He appointed a sensible entourage of medical staff and bodyguards, who were thereafter never far from his person. Empathy for his fellow man had never previously been counted among his strengths, yet he now displayed a renewed interest in the safety of containment protocols, in the healthcare benefits afforded to Foundation employees, and a profound distaste for the sacrifice of D-class personnel. None of this, given the circumstances of his return, struck the council as particularly alarming. In retrospect, it should have. He had concealed the crux of the matter from all of us. At first. In the initial interrogation, the obvious question had been posed. He was asked whether he retained any experience or memory of the afterlife. He claimed to recall nothing, exactly as everyone always does, and defeated the polygraphs completely. Approximately 2 months ago, he approached one of the council members in private. He inquired whether, during his absence from duty, the Foundation had obtained any pieces, and that word was his, not ours, capable of sustaining life indefinitely. What follows is an internal editorial notation appended to the file, preserved here in its recorded form for the sake of procedural completeness. The editor advises that the kill sprite preceding this section was assembled hastily. The prior instance, constructed and installed by a predecessor, is characterized as clearly defective. Where a standard inoculation interdiction should have produced what the editor terms a donkey kick, the reader was instead expected to register only minor eye strain. The editor concedes that, under prevailing circumstances, resources are limited to a contaminated workstation and barely adequate tools. If the reader has survived the intervening memetic hazard, the editor hopes this is attributable to possession of code word clearance and not to a failure of construction on the editor's own part. In the latter case, the reader is presumed to be in a compromised condition, and the editor offers apology for failure to terminate in time. The editor then requests a measure of understanding. 90 minutes prior to composition, the only procedures on file for the relevant code word were consulted and read as follows. Randomly select one mainframe qualified coder from the Experimental Containment Research Group with Level 3 clearance. Supply the designee with a Behemoth-class amnestic and dispatch them to the affected terminal. They will find instructions there. If they fail to complete their task within 2 hours, or if, upon return, they can remember the year or name the current U.S. president, terminate. The editor observes that this constitutes a rather small subset of personnel from which to draw a random selection. The editor further remarks, with evident resignation, that Spock smashes scissors, but paper disproves Spock, and that in return for containment duty, a sizable portion of the editor's own memory is now scheduled for excision. The editor closes on a note of grim consolation, expressing relief at not being required to retain recollection of the processing of the individual, described only as the looky-loo, whose intrusion is identified as the proximate cause of the present containment breach. Appended to the technical documentation is a personal note from the previous respondent, catalogued only as Andrews. The note advises that, assuming the reader shares the author's clearance designation, the reader has almost certainly never heard of the system referenced as Damerung prior to review. From the state of the source code and its embedded comments, Andrews estimates himself to be the fourth or fifth agent to respond to the anomaly since its inception. He reports having made only minor edits to the preceding documentation, having spent the majority of his allotted time attempting to slow the underlying algorithm by inserting the least efficient patterns available to him. He states that, in the end, he was able to de-optimize the existing recursion by a factor of 2. Andrews expresses uncertainty as to the practical value of this reduction, citing insufficient knowledge of the underlying hardware and of the frequency with which users follow unfamiliar links from the main index. He speculates that, upon first implementation, the original designers may have anticipated an interval of 5 to 10 years between breaches, but notes that at least one quantum processor has since been introduced to the grid, which he asserts will render the present approach obsolete at an accelerated rate. He expresses hope that the next respondent will devise a slower algorithm than he or the 3 previous authors managed. He offers, in an apparently informal register, the suggestion of a quantum BOGO sort of the article numbers, before observing that on the present hardware, this might technically constitute an XK-class algorithm and therefore be forbidden. He concludes by stating that he has exhausted the greater part of his allotted time and cannot risk a further recompile in the minutes remaining before he must commit his changes. A postscript follows, its formatting degraded and its punctuation increasingly irregular. In it, Andrews acknowledges having acted upon an impulse he was unable to resist, identifies the source of that impulse as a fridge-class cognitohazard, notes that its effects are already manifesting, and expresses hope that a countermeasure in his possession will take effect quickly. The transcript resumes with the technician offering a workaround. He states, quote, Okay, there is a mechanism I could take advantage of. It's actually designed to protect against anomalous data corruption, but it would have the effect you're looking for. If you're certain, ma'am, I could make this section of the article right once and splice it into the database runtime. However, that means no editing whatsoever will be possible. If you misspeak, you'll just have to clarify and keep going, unquote. The subject responds, quote, Very well, do so. Fortunately, I am a world-class dictator, unquote. The technician requests her credential token. Keyboard sounds are recorded. He then states, quote, There, that's done it. You've been very helpful. That will be all. For your own safety, I am ordering you to obtain amnestic treatment as soon as possible, enough to forget this entire morning. Do you understand? Unquote. The technician answers, quote, I do, unquote. The subject continues, quote, Good. You will likely be subjected to enhanced interrogation within a day or two. It will go easier for you if you have no memory of this, unquote. The technician replies, quote, Oh boy, unquote. The subject then states, quote, As a literal token of my gratitude for your loyalty, why don't you hold on to those credentials? I won't be needing them. If you act quickly, I suspect you can think of a way to put them to good use before they are revoked and you are detained, unquote. The technician stammers an affirmation. The subject concludes, quote, Now go. I foresee that you have a fine career ahead of you. We will not speak again, unquote. A door is heard opening and closing. An extended sigh is recorded. The subject then addresses the record directly, identifying herself as Miriam Prather, and stating that she has held her designation for 77 years and will retain it for perhaps 7 minutes more. The record continues. She observes that other sources of information have always been available to the Foundation. Yet, in light of recent events, she has come to believe that the anomalous entities interrogated on this topic across the decades were guilty of either ignorance or deceit. And so, she explains, an exception was invented. 6 months prior to the recording, a former overseer, designated in life as 0511, was resurrected by a novel procedure. The theoretical groundwork had existed for some time, but the complexity of the process, the technical skill required, the systemic risks, and the enormous cost meant that only the direst need could justify the attempt. The subject had been the youngest overseer at the time of his death, aged 73. He had maintained 2 habits peculiar for one of his station, tolerated only marginally by his peers then, and now forbidden altogether. The first was an obstinate refusal to fortify, as the practice is called, to enhance his longevity with the supplements available to those of his rank. The second was a penchant for taking his holidays unannounced and in complete solitude. When a stroke ended him 18 years prior, he was perched on a rocky promontory above marine iguana nesting grounds on Hispaniola Island. Recovery of his remains required 14 years. The search would not have persisted so long, but for 2 considerations. He carried on his person a certain key, of which the record declines to elaborate, except to note that it could not be permitted to remain lost. He also retained within his brain a secret word, without which he could not be replaced. The alternating rains and harsh sun of the archipelago, and perhaps the attentions of hawks, had reduced him to a moldering ruin of bone fragments and only the most stubborn sinew. The recovery team employed brooms and bags to collect what remained. The artifact was retrieved, to considerable relief. There remained, however, the daunting task of extracting his shibboleth. It is now understood that breathtaking longevity lies within institutional reach, yet immortality does not. The Foundation's most capable theoreticians have recently advanced the position that immortality will remain forever unattainable. Even the most exceptional resurrections in the record, including his, cannot be repeated more than once or twice. Sapient life is bound inextricably to quantum uncertainty. A particle localized with perfect precision acquires infinitely uncertain momentum and is lost in an instant. By the same principle, the longer and the more tightly a consciousness is tethered to a specific vessel, the more probable its irretrievable scattering. Regardless of science, magic, or lesser stagecraft, personnel, their descendants, and their remote descendants will one day most assuredly die and remain so. His disappointment at this theorem was palpable, and the observer noted a moment of personal discomfort at his reaction. Not a week later, 052 received word of a severe breach of protocol. The subject, referred to here as Roger, or rather 0511, had initiated direct contact with an anomaly in containment, designated as an apex-tier pluripotent entity. Level 3 personnel are advised to interpret the euphemism accordingly. The initial investigation was conducted off the books. His concealment had been thorough. No breach alarm sounded. No log preserved the encounter. However, one of the entity's assigned guards failed a random amnestic test, to his dismay, and that discrepancy proved sufficient to set investigators upon the trail. Proof was not obtained, but it was surmised that he had risked exposure to the entity in order to offer some manner of arrangement. This could not stand. As 2 of his oldest comrades, 052 and the narrator, confronted him privately. He caught them off guard. He confessed everything, and he begged them for help. The narrator surreptitiously recorded his pleas as a precaution. The recording is reproduced below. A device clicks. I dared not speak of this at first. You would never have let me out of containment. The truth is, I was aware of all of it. I suppose there was a sweet oblivion, like deep sleep, at first. But in retrospect, I think it was no more than a day. The subject's account continues. My skin, he stated, blistered and split in the sunlight, and biting insects descended rapidly. He described feeling eggs hatch and larvae crawl, gases building and bursting within him, individual cells rupturing, interstitial fluids souring and blackening. Yet somehow, he reported, his capacity to experience and store these sensations grew. Even as he was keenly aware of his cerebrum being scattered and devoured, his perception expanded into the gizzards of birds and the depths of fire ant dens. He was aware, he said, of every fingernail and strand of hair that pulled away in the wind, and his sensation clung to them as they settled in the ocean and dissolved in the maws of 1 trillion diatoms. He stated that he did not understand it. The more bits of him there were, the larger his capacity for the perception of pain. As he decayed into pieces smaller than living nerves could possibly distinguish, the character of the discomfort changed from burning and aching and breaking, which he might relate in human terms, to something worse that he could not fully articulate. A terrible, maddening stretching of every part of himself from every other part. Humans, he noted, often numb to chronic pains in life. Yet every year, every month, every second that passed, he swore, it only intensified over time. In his previous life, the subject reflected, he had ruminated on heaven and hell and the likelihood of his experiencing one, the other, or something in between. As terrible as he had imagined the torpor of heaven or the torments of hell to be, this was entirely different from either. In hell, at least, there would surely be a tormentor, some memory of his deeds, some sense of justice, even if his soul rejected its logic. He could imagine, he said, some comfort in hell for a mind such as his. The recording continues. The subject, speaking with mounting urgency, declares that he will not return to that existence, not in 100 years, not ever. He confirms that he approached the entity known as Ahriman for help, believing that Ahriman could extend all of them if he wished. He offered great concessions from the Foundation, including, perhaps, release. Ahriman laughed and refused. Yet the subject insists there are others willing to trade on a smaller scale, though the price may be nearly as. He does not finish the thought. He says only that nothing compares, and that anything is better, so long as it is forever. He pleads with those present to believe him, to join him, and together to escape this fate. A device is heard clicking. The narrator recounts that those assembled were dumbfounded, then sympathetic, then, in an instant, afraid. He cannot recall the last time his heart raced so. But the Foundation, he reminds himself, does not operate in a vacuum. A revelation of this magnitude required consideration by the Council. The subject was reluctant to admit his deception before the assembled body, yet clearly desperate for action, and was prevailed upon to convene an emergency teleconference. The narrator notes that anything less would have constituted treachery. Still, as the three of them hurried to Conference Room Alpha, he found himself harboring subtle thoughts he does not commit to record. A throat is cleared. The subject gave his testimony again, nearly as frank and as ornately worded as before. The debate that followed, the narrator states, was unlike anything he had witnessed. Skeptical voices spoke first, calm, concerned, thoughtful. Then one member of the council, whose face had grown increasingly pale, became a passionate advocate for action. She demanded that human death itself be declared a Keter-class anomaly and contained at any cost. The absurdity, predictably, provoked uproar. But the subject now had an ally and pressed his case, shouting over the others, adding darker details of the intensity of his perennial excruciation. Imagery, the narrator records, that he cannot repeat. Sensations he must not contemplate. The file resumes, and here the record shifts from testimony to the mechanics of the record itself. What follows is not a description of the anomaly, but a description of the article that describes it. Observe the header. Where an item number should appear, the field is empty. Where an object class should appear, the field is empty. In place of a designation, the record produces only a fault string. Catastrophic abort at D09E2AD9. Handle not found. The database, in effect, cannot locate the thing it is meant to catalog. It reports the failure and continues regardless. Under special containment procedures, the file addresses the reader directly. The article, it states, is a Damarone-class cognitohazard. All personnel, regardless of clearance, are forbidden to expose themselves to the description of this article under any circumstances. The reader is instructed not to tamper with the warning without Damarone clearance, and not to discuss the existence of the article with any person. No disciplinary action will be necessary, the file assures, provided the reader closes the article now and clears the browser cache. The warning then concedes its own peculiar situation. Atypical software measures, it explains, have been used to mitigate the risk of accidental exposure. It is only by an unfortunate coincidence of extremely low probability that the reader has stumbled across this entry at all. Once again, the file offers absolution on the condition that the reader close the article and clear the cache. A further paragraph explains the deeper problem. Since creation, only the special containment procedures section of the record has ever been editable. Due to the clearance of the original author and anomalous database limitations in effect, the record can neither be deleted nor effectively redacted. Access restrictions, the file notes with a certain resignation, cannot be applied to the data in any reliable way. The article, in other words, protects itself only by asking to be closed and by trusting that the reader will comply before the threshold of exposure has quietly and without ceremony already been crossed. As previously indicated, this article ignores the delete command. It cannot be extricated from the database without extensive collateral corruption of other critical systems. In lieu of removal, the containment strategy is to minimize the probability of a user discovering this entry by chance. To this end, an unhaltable mainframe process, bearing its own internal identifier, repeatedly switches the ordinal designation of this article with that of another randomly selected entry. Under ordinary administrative conditions, when two article numbers are exchanged, both entries disappear from the index only momentarily. A kernel exploit of a known processor erratum permits Foundation technicians to delay the completion of this subroutine by deeply recursing the renumbering operation with an intentionally inefficient sorting algorithm, currently BOGO-sort, applied against a known corrupt stack in extended memory. The thread continues until it aborts catastrophically, the index swap completes, and the process restarts. This inserts an artificial delay of enormous magnitude between intervals of visibility, during which a link to this article becomes briefly reachable from the main article index before the cycle repeats. Breach will therefore only occur in the unlikely event that a user with index privileges loads the main list at precisely the correct moment and, in defiance of need-to-know best practices, follows the link, disregards the warnings, and continues reading past the first paragraph. The intervals between visibility are indeterminate but finite. On average, these intervals grow longer as the number of available articles grows and shorter as the mainframe's hot swappable processors increase in computational throughput. This containment method carries a gravely serious side effect. The article randomly selected for each swap also vanishes from the list for the corresponding interval, until reappearing under a new identifier. The Overseer Council has authorized this detrimental consequence as acceptable. Personnel are expressly ordered not to verify this authorization through the chain of command, as no other living individual is presently aware that this article, this process, or this authorization exists. Should validation be required, an inline authorization key block follows in the record. Personnel proceeding past this point remain subject to summary termination by mimetic countermeasure.